In August of 2022, the demolition of the old Apex Motors plant was just another job, a routine leveling of Detroit's industrial past. But on the third floor of the West Wing, an excavator claw bit into a cinder block wall that, according to the blueprints, shouldn't have existed. It tore through crumbling mortar and then ground to a halt against something unyielding and smooth. Dust swirled in the beams of the worklights, settling on the impossible gleam of cherry-red paint and polished chrome. Behind the wall, perfectly preserved, sat a 1978 Apex Concorde sedan, entombed in a chamber of concrete and silence. It wasn't a forgotten storage bay. It was a purpose-built crypt, a steel sarcophagus sealed away for over 40 years. The crew supervisor made the call. Within the hour, the site was no longer a demolition zone. It was a crime scene. At that moment, the file on Frank Miller, a 42-year-old foreman who had vanished without a trace on a Friday night in 1978, was officially reopened. The mystery of the man who walked out of the factory and into thin air was about to be solved. And the answer had been waiting, parked just a few hundred feet from where he was last seen. Friday, October 13th, 1978, began like any other for Frank Miller. The air held the sharp bite of a Michigan autumn, and the morning was a comfortable routine of coffee, the newspaper, and getting his son, David, ready for school. He was more than a line foreman at Apex Motors. He was the volunteer coach for the Detroit Hammers, and David was his star quarterback. That morning, a bright red football helmet sat on the kitchen table. Frank was taking it to the plant to get signatures from the guys on the line, a good luck charm for the upcoming championship game. It was a promise to his son, a symbol of a future filled with Friday night lights and victory cheers. His wife, Susan, noticed the worry that had been clouding his eyes for weeks. He'd been quieter, more distracted. When she asked, he just shook his head and said, "It's just Vance," pushing the line too hard for his bonus. Arthur Vance, the plant manager, was a name that had become a source of tension in their home, a shadow cast by the factory's towering smokestacks. Frank kissed her goodbye, grabbed his lunchbox and the helmet, and told her he wouldn't be late for dinner. It was the last time she would ever see him. At the plant, the day was a cacophony of hissing pneumatics and the rhythmic clang of steel. Miller was respected on the floor. He was fair, he was thorough, and he was the union man who had their backs. He moved along the assembly line, checking welds, signing off on inspection sheets, and occasionally stopping to inspect a steering column with a focused intensity that made some of the younger workers uneasy. He was a man who believed in doing things right, a principle that was becoming increasingly difficult to uphold within the walls of Apex Motors. The 5 o'clock whistle screamed, signaling the end of the shift. Frank Miller said his goodbyes, the helmet tucked under his arm. He walked past the rows of freshly assembled Concordes, their paint gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He punched his time card, a crisp, mechanical stamp marking the end of his workday, and though no one knew it, the end of his life. He stepped out of the main building and into the sprawling employee parking lot as the evening began to draw in. Back at home, the dinner Susan had prepared grew cold on the stove. 6 o'clock passed, then 7. David came inside from the yard, asking where his dad was. The first calls Susan made were tinged with annoyance, which slowly curdled into concern and then into raw fear. The plant's night security confirmed he had clocked out on time. His car was still in the lot, they said. His friends hadn't heard from him. By midnight, the Miller home was filled with a silence so profound, so absolute, it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Frank Miller had simply ceased to be. Detective Maria Rossi of the Detroit PD Cold Case Unit stood behind the yellow tape, watching the scene unfold with a practiced, methodical gaze. The air was thick with the chalky smell of pulverized concrete. Forensic investigators, looking like astronauts on a dead planet, were carefully dismantling the rest of the brick wall, block by numbered block. Each piece was catalogued, each layer of mortar examined. This wasn't original factory construction. The materials were different, the workmanship hurried but effective. It was a seal, not a wall. Once access was cleared, the focus shifted to the car itself. The cherry-red Concorde sat under the harsh glare of portable floodlights, its chrome trim reflecting the faces of the investigators staring in. The interior was a pristine tableau of 1978. The vinyl seats showed no signs of wear, the dashboard was free of dust, and the air inside, once the doors were carefully opened, was stale but clean. It was a showroom model locked in a vacuum. The mileage was 6.2 miles. The gas tank was full. The battery, of course, was dead. In the driver's seat sat the remains of Frank Miller. His work overalls, made of durable denim, were remarkably preserved. His wallet, tucked in the back pocket, contained his Apex Motors ID and a faded picture of his wife and son. The medical examiner noted the position of the skeleton. Upright, almost peaceful. The hands, bone white and delicate, were cupped around a red football helmet resting in his lap. There were no signs of a struggle inside the vehicle. The keys were not in the ignition. The doors had been unlocked. The first critical questions began to form, hanging in the dust-filled air like ghosts. Who had the authority to pull a brand new car off the assembly line before it was even logged for shipping? Who could organize a construction crew to build an unrecorded 8-inch thick concrete wall inside the factory? A task that required materials, manpower, and absolute silence. And why the helmet? It was a deeply personal object, a piece of a loving father's life placed deliberately within this industrial tomb. The forensic pathologist's initial report from the scene only deepened the mystery. A preliminary examination of the skull revealed a depressed fracture on the right temporal bone, evidence of a single powerful blow with a heavy, blunt object. Frank Miller was dead before he was ever placed in the driver's seat. This was not an accident. It was not a suicide. This was a carefully staged burial, a meticulously planned operation designed to erase a man from the face of the earth, orchestrated by someone with the power to alter blueprints, command workers, and seal a man's grave with the very products he helped to create. The original 1978 investigation into Frank Miller's disappearance followed a predictable and ultimately tragic script. With no body and no signs of foul play in the parking lot, the Detroit Police Department quickly settled on the most convenient theory. Frank Miller had simply walked away. He had a wife, a son, a steady job, but in the eyes of overworked detectives, it was a story they had heard before. They pointed to the lack of a struggle, the neatly parked car. The fact that his bank account was untouched and his final paycheck was never cashed were treated as inconvenient details, not as evidence contradicting their narrative. Susan Miller's desperate pleas were dismissed as the grief of a wife unable to accept abandonment. When she insisted that Frank would never leave his son, especially not before the championship game, she was met with sympathetic nods and weary sighs. The investigation became a matter of procedure, of ticking boxes. A missing persons report was filed, a bulletin was issued, and then, for the most part, nothing. Apex Motors, for its part, erected a wall of corporate procedure that was far more impenetrable than the one made of concrete. Arthur Vance, the plant manager, expressed his deepest sympathies to the family and promised full cooperation with the police. In practice, this cooperation was a carefully managed performance. Police interviews with employees were conducted on-site in conference rooms provided by management, often with a company representative present. The message was unspoken but clear. Watch what you say. The workforce, already dependent on the company for their livelihoods, understood. They kept their heads down. The official company line was that Frank was a good man, and his disappearance was a personal tragedy, entirely unrelated to his work at Apex. Within weeks, the leads dried up. The police, facing a dozen other fresh homicides that month, quietly moved the Miller file from the active desk to the cold case cabinet. The narrative was set in stone. Frank Miller was just another man who cracked under the pressure of his life and vanished. The family's pain was relegated to the realm of private grief, and the plant continued to churn out thousands of new cars. The silence that fell over the Frank Miller case wasn't an absence of noise. It was a carefully constructed barrier built from police indifference, corporate stonewalling, and the palpable fear of those who might have known the truth. It was a silence that held for 44 years. Detective Maria Rossi understood the unique nature of silence in a factory town. Her own grandfather had worked the line at Apex for 30 years and spoke of Frank Miller in hushed, reverent tones as an honest man in a den of wolves. Now, Rossi was tasked with breaking a silence that had solidified over 4 decades. She began by tracking down the men who had worked alongside Miller. They were in their 70s and 80s now, scattered across the Rust Belt, living out their retirements in quiet suburbs. The fear, however, was not retired. The interviews all followed a similar pattern. At the mention of Frank Miller, there was a flicker of recognition, a sad shake of the head. But when Rossi mentioned Arthur Vance, a familiar, shuttered look would fall across their faces. They remembered nothing. They saw nothing. One former line worker, his hands still gnarled from a life of factory work, simply stared out his window and said, "That place. It had its own rules. Best not to ask questions you don't want the answers to." Their memories were a collection of dead ends and contradictions, walled off by a fear that time had not eroded. Frustrated by the living, Rossi turned to the dead, the archives. In a climate-controlled warehouse downtown sat the paper soul of Apex Motors, tons of documents, logbooks, and personnel files. For weeks, Rossi's team sifted through a mountain of paper, the dry rustle of turning pages the only sound in the room. They were looking for a single anomaly, a crack in the perfect facade of corporate normalcy. They found small things at first. An employee transfer order dated the week after Miller vanished, sending a vocal union steward to a plant in Ohio for a minor infraction. A series of unusual security patrol reports noting unauthorized access to the West Wing, all filed in the month leading up to Miller's disappearance with no follow-up action taken. Then, buried in a box of financial records, they found purchase orders. One, from early October 1978, stood out. An order for a pallet of cinder blocks and 10 bags of high-strength mortar delivered not to a construction site but directly to the West Wing loading dock. The stated purpose was routine partition maintenance. But the real discovery came from the payroll archives. It was a single sheet of paper, an overtime authorization slip dated Friday, October 13th, 1978. It was for a 3-man maintenance crew, a team that didn't usually work the evening shift. They were paid a hefty cash bonus for 5 hours of work from 6 p.m. to 11 p.m. The job description was listed as emergency structural repair. The location specified was the 3rd floor of the West Wing. The signature at the bottom, a sharp, arrogant scrawl, was clear and undeniable. Arthur Vance. Just as the investigation seemed to be closing in on the corporate structure of Apex Motors, a new lead pulled it in a completely different direction. An interview with a retired union chapter president, a man named Leo Wysocki, introduced a compelling alternative. Wysocki, initially reluctant to talk, eventually spoke of the deep divisions within the union in the autumn of 1978. Frank Miller, he explained, was a moderate, a pragmatist. But a more militant faction, led by a charismatic and aggressive line worker named Jack Kowalski, was pushing for a crippling strike right before the holiday season. Kowalski saw Frank as a sellout, Wysocki said, his voice a low rasp. Said he was in Vance's pocket, the bad blood between them. It was real. Suddenly, a new and plausible motive emerged. Miller wasn't killed by management. He was silenced by his own union brothers. The theory was that Kowalski's faction, believing Miller was about to betray them by preventing the strike, eliminated him. It explained the lack of a struggle in the parking lot. Miller would have trusted a fellow union man. For weeks, this became the primary focus of the investigation. Rossi's team dug into Kowalski's life. They discovered he had a volatile temper and a history of confrontations with management and fellow workers alike. He had died of a heart attack in 1992, a convenient fact for a potential posthumous suspect. The team spent precious time building a case against a ghost. They tracked down other members of Kowalski's faction, men who confirmed the intense animosity toward Miller. They found minutes from union meetings that detailed shouting matches between the two men. The narrative felt solid, a gritty story of union politics turned deadly. It was a classic Detroit tale, and for a moment, it seemed like the answer. The district attorney's office began preparing a press release, ready to close the 44-year-old case by naming Jack Kowalski as the prime suspect. The theory collapsed under the weight of a single, undeniable piece of evidence. After weeks of searching, Rossi located Kowalski's estranged daughter living in Chicago. She remembered her father as an angry, bitter man, but not a killer. To prove it, she gave Rossi a box of his old belongings, including a set of worn daily journals. Rossi and her team spent a night poring over the cramped, angry script. The entry for Friday, October 13th, 1978, stopped them cold. Kowalski wrote, "Miller didn't show for the late meeting. The coward probably went home. Heard from one of the guys he was going to confront Vance tonight about the faulty steering columns on the new Concordes. Let the snake eat the rat for all I care." The entry provided Kowalski with an alibi. He was at a union hall waiting for a man who would never arrive. But in doing so, it blew the case wide open. The false trail, the weeks spent chasing a union ghost, had inadvertently delivered the key. It wasn't just a vague suspicion about management anymore. For the first time, the investigation had a specific reason for Miller's murder: faulty steering columns. And the journal entry placed Frank Miller in one location on his final night: a confrontation with Arthur Vance. Kowalski's journal had given the investigation its why: the faulty steering columns. Now, with a clear motive, Detective Rossi ordered a complete re-examination of every piece of evidence recovered from the Apex Concorde. Every fiber, every document, every object was placed under the microscope once more. The focus inevitably returned to the most incongruous item in the tomb: the bright red Detroit Hammers football helmet. It was a piece of Frank Miller's other life, his family life, and Rossi had a gut feeling it held more than just a tragic memory. In the sterile environment of the State Police Forensics Lab, a technician painstakingly disassembled the helmet. The foam padding, hardened with age, was carefully separated from the shell. And there, tucked deep inside a crevice where it had been wedged with desperate intent, was a small, tightly folded piece of paper. It was a standard vehicle inspection tag, the kind Miller would have used dozens of times a day. With tweezers, the technician unfolded the brittle document under a magnifying lamp. On it, in Frank Miller's distinct, neat handwriting, were a series of part numbers. Below them was a short, chilling message. The words, written over 4 decades ago, felt like a shout in the silent lab. "Steering locks at high speed. Vance knows. Said to sign off anyway. God help us." This was it. This was not a theory or a rumor from a dead man's journal. This was a direct accusation from the victim himself, a final report filed from the edge of the grave. It was the physical link, the irrefutable proof that Miller's disappearance was directly tied to a dangerous cover-up, orchestrated by the one man with the power to enforce it: Arthur Vance. The note was a bombshell, but Rossi knew it wasn't enough to convict a reclusive multimillionaire. She needed a living witness, an accomplice who could place Vance at the scene. Her team pored over the Apex personnel files from 1978, focusing on Vance's inner circle. His head of security was a man named George Petrov. Cross-referencing his name with old DMV records delivered the final, stunning piece of the puzzle. In November of 1978, 1 month after Frank Miller vanished, George Petrov had purchased a brand new Apex Concorde for his son's 18th birthday, a car from the exact production batch Miller had flagged as fatally defective. Rossi found Petrov living in a rundown bungalow in a forgotten Detroit suburb, a frail, stooped man haunted by the ghosts of his past. He initially denied everything, his hands trembling as he clutched a cup of coffee. But Rossi didn't need to raise her voice. She simply laid the evidence on his small kitchen table: the overtime slip for the secret maintenance crew, a copy of Miller's note from the helmet, and finally, a photograph of the 1978 DMV registration for the car he had bought for his son. She asked him one simple question. "Was a free car the price of your silence, George?" The old man stared at the documents, his face crumbling. 44 years of carefully maintained silence shattered in an instant. A single choked sob escaped his lips, then another. The dam of guilt, fear, and regret burst. Through his tears, he looked at Rossi and nodded. "I'll tell you everything," he whispered, his voice cracking under the immense weight of his confession. "I'll tell you what happened that night." Based on George Petrov's videotaped confession, the final hours of Frank Miller's life came into sharp, horrifying focus. After clocking out, Miller did not go to his car. He went to Arthur Vance's second-floor office overlooking the assembly line, the inspection tag with his damning note clutched in his hand. Petrov was there, serving as Vance's loyal shadow. Miller laid the tag on the polished desk and quietly told Vance he could not and would not sign off on the defective steering columns. He was going to the union leadership and then to the press. The argument that began in the sterile quiet of the office spilled out onto the deserted factory floor. The vast space, usually a symphony of industry, was now an echoing chamber for their two voices: Miller's, firm and righteous; Vance's, laced with a rising tide of panic and fury. Vance saw his career, his massive bonus, his entire future about to be destroyed by one honest man. He threatened Miller, then pleaded with him, but Frank Miller would not be moved. He had made his decision. It was then that Vance snapped. His eyes fell upon a heavy-duty torque wrench left behind on a maintenance cart. He grabbed the solid steel tool, its weight a sudden, brutal extension of his rage. According to Petrov, who stood frozen just a few yards away, the argument stopped, replaced by a swift, dark motion. A sickening, wet thud cut through the air, a sound utterly alien to the normal mechanics of the plant. Frank Miller fell face first onto the concrete floor he had walked for 20 years. The red football helmet he had been carrying rolled a few feet away and came to a stop, its bright color a stark contrast to the spreading pool of darkness. A ringing silence descended upon the factory floor. For a moment, Vance simply stared at what he had done, the wrench still in his hand. Then, the ruthless pragmatist took over. He turned to his head of security, his face a pale mask of adrenaline. "Handle it, George," was all he said. The order was absolute. Petrov, trapped by years of loyalty and fear, complied. He summoned his most trusted security guards, while Vance made a single phone call to a loyalist maintenance foreman. They worked with cold efficiency in the hours that followed. A brand new Apex Concorde, cherry red and destined for a dealership in Ohio, was quietly driven off the line. They placed Frank Miller's body in the driver's seat, positioning him upright. Petrov, in a final, inexplicable act, perhaps of guilt, perhaps of a twisted sense of order, picked up the football helmet from the floor and gently placed it in Miller's lap, his skeletal hands cupped around it for eternity. The car, now a hearse, was driven slowly to the disused storage bay in the West Wing. There, under the dim work lights, the paid maintenance crew was already waiting with a pallet of cinder blocks and fresh mortar. As Vance and Petrov watched from the shadows, they began to lay the first course of bricks, sealing the Red Sepulchre and its occupant away from the world. Armed with George Petrov's confession, the wheels of justice, frozen for 44 years, began to turn with startling speed. The next morning, a convoy of Detroit police cruisers and media vans descended upon the immaculate high-security estate of Arthur Vance in Grosse Pointe. They found the 88-year-old multimillionaire on his perfectly manicured lawn, inspecting his rose bushes. As the warrant for first-degree murder was read, the frail old man showed no remorse, no fear, only a flash of the same arrogant fury that had cost Frank Miller his life. He snarled at the cameras as he was led away in handcuffs, a defiant tyrant to the very end. Vance's wealth bought him a team of high-priced lawyers, but it could not buy him time. He would never face a jury. 2 months after his arrest, while awaiting trial, Arthur Vance died of a massive stroke in his jail cell, taking his final, unrepentant secrets with him. As for his accomplice, George Petroff, his confession was the linchpin of the entire case. In a plea agreement, he pleaded guilty to manslaughter and concealing a crime. His sentence was significantly reduced in exchange for his full testimony, a final, pragmatic transaction in a story defined by cold, corporate logic. The Miller family, led by an elderly but resolute Susan and her middle-aged son David, attended every court proceeding. They never made a spectacle of their grief. In a quiet statement to the press, David Miller spoke not of hatred, but of a profound and painful relief. "For 4 decades, we lived in the dark," he said, his mother's hand in his. "We had a ghost in our family. Now, we have the truth. It doesn't bring him back, but it lets him rest. And it lets us remember him for who he was, not for how he disappeared." The case of the Apex tomb became a national sensation, a grim parable of corporate power and the slow, grinding path to the truth. It sparked a public conversation about accountability and the long-forgotten victims of industrial America's golden age. Justice, in a legal sense, had been served. The case was officially closed, the perpetrators identified, and their fates sealed. But for those who had lived through the long years of silence, the verdict was a hollow echo. The court could close a file, but it could not restore a life, nor could it erase the memory of a family shattered by a single act of brutal, calculated greed. The Apex Motors plant is gone now. The last of its steel skeleton was dismantled, the concrete foundations were pulverized into dust, and the land was scraped clean. In its place is the Frank Miller Memorial Park. The smokestacks that once stained the Detroit sky have been replaced by newly planted saplings that sway in the Michigan wind. Where thousands of men once built machines, children now play on manicured lawns. The past has been professionally erased and landscaped over. The red sepulchre, the cherry-red Apex Concorde that served as both a coffin and a time capsule, was never destroyed. It remains in a climate-controlled facility at the Michigan State Police Forensic Lab. It is no longer a car, but an artifact. A silent, three-dimensional monument to a crime studied by cadets and investigators. A grim illustration of how deep a secret can be buried, and a testament to the fact that even the most perfect tombs are eventually opened. The accounts were settled in the cold ledger of the law. Arthur Vance died before he could be judged by a jury, and George Petroff served his time before fading back into obscurity. The Miller family finally had their answers, trading the torment of the unknown for the heavy certainty of the truth. They were given a park named after their husband and father, a public acknowledgement that was both a comfort and a constant, quiet reminder of their loss. In the end, the industrial empire that Arthur Vance built and killed for proved to be temporary. Apex Motors was sold and absorbed in the 1990s, its brand name now just a memory. Vance's fortune was carved up by lawyers and distant relatives. Everything he fought to protect, his power, his legacy, his wealth, dissolved with time. The only thing that endured, the one element that proved indestructible, was a small, folded piece of paper with a few handwritten words hidden inside a football helmet. A single act of integrity sealed in a tomb that outlasted it all. Today, the ground at the park is smooth and green, as if it holds no memory of the concrete and steel that once stood upon it. But the silence that hangs in the autumn air is different from the one that filled the factory for 44 years. That was the silence of a secret being kept, heavy and suffocating. This is the silence of a secret revealed. It doesn't scream, it endures.